Hey everybody, welcome to episode 66 of the AskDAP show, where we answer your Volkswagen Audi questions. On this episode, we talk about Mark 7 manual transmission shift forks, putting a tubular exhaust manifold with your stock turbo, and finding oil leaks.
Jacob Holmes via YouTube says, do the Mark 7 also have brass shift forks? I shift very fast, so this has me worried about long-term reliability.
Alright, so what Jacob is referring to is actually a video we shot talking about how manual transmissions work. On Friday of this week, we have episode 4 of our Project Mark 5 build launching. That's where we install steel shift forks in our Mark 5 transmission, as well as a wave track limit slip differential. But during that time, we obviously talk briefly during the how transmissions work, which I'll link to in the description below. In that video, we talk about basically upgrading the shift forks. And so the question is does the Mark 7 trans have the brass shift forks, which are more susceptible to breaking or cracking under heavy shifting circumstances? I looked this up in the catalog, the parts catalog, to determine if they were the same or different. They were only sold as a kit. Then I went down the road of determining the individual ones that make up that kit. I have determined that the replacement ones were steel, but I wanted to verify that inside the trans that maybe there wasn't a replacement of that part number with a steel shift fork. So I reached out to a friend of mine, Mitch, who actually has a diff in his car, and so his transmission case has been opened on his manual Mark 7 GTI, and he said that that car did also have steel shift forks. So you can be pretty certain that if you have a Mark 7 GTI, that it would have steel shift forks in the factory. We also did look up Golf R ones. The Golf R ones actually were also indeed steel. So anybody with a Mark 7, you shouldn't have to worry. You already have these steel shift forks in your car.
QBuster via YouTube says, why is it so notchy when shifting from second gear for many of us 6-speed manual folks? I feel like I have to try way too hard sometimes when trying to shift into second. What could be causing that?
So here's another question asked on that how manual trans works video. Obviously, when we get into manual trans, people start asking questions about that. So this gentleman, or this lady or gentleman, is actually asking questions about manual trans and getting into second gear. I have a couple thoughts on this. Obviously, there's a lot of things that I don't know, but first is obviously if you have a short shifter, they're going to tend to be more notchy just by nature. The shorter the shift is on that, so usually the larger the reduction in shift throw would be the notchier they end up getting. So usually a lot of times you can go down the road of getting something really short, but it isn't as smooth as what you'd find from the factory. It would be more notchy and tougher to get into gear. If that's not the case, if you have either all factory stuff or maybe something like the European one that we did a video about for the Mark 7, that one would generally not cause a lot of notchiness. But the one thing I do want to touch on in regards to that is if you're having issues around your shifter, you should actually check or recalibrate the positioning of your shifter. There is a procedure by VW in the repair manual. Basically what happens is you need to there's a pin that you lock in place on the shifter, and then you would also lock it in place on the trans, and then you would loosen all the shift pieces up and then reset them in place with everything kind of locked down. That would be the correct process for properly adjusting it. If you do that and you still have an issue, most likely, this is just my thoughts on this, is you could potentially, if you're somebody who bangs gears a lot, like 1-2 and 2-3, you could have issues with your synchros. And basically what a synchro is, we kind of showed in that manual trans video, but unfortunately we didn't have any out of the car to kind of give you an idea of what a synchro does. But essentially you have a gear here and a gear here, and in the middle there is a sleeve that goes up and down to select the gear. That sleeve, between that and the gear itself, there's something called a synchronizer ring. That synchronizer ring is spinning, and it allows the gear, the sleeve, to actually slide up onto the gear itself to select it. Obviously, it spins so that it can match up and actually slide in place properly while everything is still moving. A lot of times what will happen, or what can potentially happen, is those synchronizer rings are, circular, obviously, the shape of the gear, and either the teeth can become worn if you're grinding gears a lot, or more importantly, if you bang gears a lot, the synchronizer can actually stretch, and so it doesn't allow it to spin as freely, which makes it potentially harder to get into gear. If that's the case, obviously the only way to replace that would be to break down the transmission, which is generally a pretty labor-intensive job if that is what the deal is. So that's one of those things that if you drive your car hard and you bang gears hard, it sounds fun, it's cool, whatever, but understand that there are ramifications of doing that, and that would be one of those things that could potentially happen if you did that often enough to the vehicle. So hopefully that's not your issue, and hopefully maybe one of the other things solve your problem, and good luck.
Brandon Jones via shopdap.com says, in the rear main seal article you mentioned, be sure the leak is not coming from higher up on the engine before deciding if this is bad. What does it mean if the oil leak is in the rear but higher up? I think that is my problem on an 07 A4 convertible.
So what Brandon is referring to is an article I put out a while back about rear main seal failures on TSI engines. Basically, what will happen is potentially on TSI engines, if the PCV blows out and is left to go for a while, or sometimes even when they blow out in general, it can cause the rear main seal to fail. If that does, you can end up with an oil leak, obviously, from your rear main seal. It talks about checking from higher up to determine where your leak is coming from, and this is pretty much how anybody diagnoses an oil leak. Is what would happen is if you brought your car into a shop and they think you might have a rear main seal, they're going to check above where the transmission is mounted to ensure that there's nothing, like, for example, let's say a valve cover that's leaking, which would cause it to run down the block and maybe seem like the rear main seal is leaking. It would run between the engine and transmission, and if it runs down, it could drip out of the bottom of the trans, making you think it's a rear main seal, or where the trans and engine meet, making you thinking it's a rear main seal, but it's actually something coming from higher up. So any oil leak on any vehicle is always going to be diagnosed by taking some sort of cleaner, brake cleaner or what have you, and spraying the engine down above that mating surface, or really checking first if you can find anything higher. And if you see a lot of dirt and grime up there, clean all that off, clean all the oil you can find off, even from below, spray up in the transmission, clean everything the best of your ability, then run the car, then check for leaks. So that is what a technician would do to determine the oil leak, because obviously he can't see inside the transmission to see what's going on. And even if you run like a sporoscope type camera, which would normally go down a cylinder, even if you run that into the bell housing, you're not going to see past the flywheel. So you're never going to see exactly where the leak is coming from while a car is still assembled, but obviously taking out the trans isn't really viable to check for a leak. So that would be my suggestion, is to go down that road. And just so you know, to calibrate, that Audi engine is going to be mounted longitudinally, which means front to back, as opposed to transverse, which would be left to right. So on a front-wheel drive car, most Volkswagens, you would be looking where the transmission mounts, which would be on the driver's side of the driver's side of the engine, and the engine compartment would be where the leak would be coming from, and you would check all the way up the cylinder head there. On that engine is going to be in the back of the engine, because the bell housing of the trans is going to mount from the back of the car to the front. So again, you're going to be looking towards the back of the engine to determine if you have any higher leaks on the engine.
Javier via YouTube says, hey, do you guys offer that long tube header on your website? I'd really like one, but for the stock turbo setup. I'm trying to run an external wastegate.
This question was asked on our episode 3 of our Project Mark 5 build. If you're not familiar, I'll link that in the description. It's where we're building a big turbo Mark 5. It's one of the guys who works here, Max. It's his vehicle, and he has a lot of projects that he had planned previously, and we're going through kind of shooting a series on that, checking all that stuff out. But this was specifically talking about, this is about the exhaust manifolds. That car has a tubular exhaust manifold with an external wastegate. If you're not familiar, you can check out that video, and I'm planning to do a future video talking about internal versus external wastegates, talking about that. But essentially, it sounds like you're looking to get this on your car to maximize the power in the car. The problem is, this is not really a viable choice for a stock turbo. Those manifolds by themselves are extremely expensive. A quality manifold like that is going to cost well over $500, probably closer to $1,000 or more. I don't know how much that specific one is. We don't manufacture it. It's made by a company called FFE. I'll try to find their website and put a link to it in the description, but that's a very expensive manifold. It's a super high quality part and is going to cost a ton of money and is not even remotely make any sense if you're doing it on a stock turbo. Furthermore, obviously running an external wastegate on a stock turbo, it doesn't really have also another viable option, because even the cost of a quality external wastegate, all these costs add up so quickly that putting a stock turbo on that it's just, no one's going to make anything, so you'd have to custom fab it, and it would be a tremendous waste of time and money to go down that road for a stock turbo. That type of thing is pretty much reserved for big turbo cars when you're looking for the higher end of horsepower builds. I understand that people want to maximize the power out of your stock turbo, but the problem is, if it costs you $1,000 for a manifold that might get you 6 horsepower, it's probably not going to be worth it in the end, because really all it's going to do is make the turbo spool a little bit better, but there are a lot of other downsides that come with that. So yeah, hopefully look down the road of maybe upgrading to a bigger turbo if you're trying to maximize that power.
Carlos via shopdap.com says, "Hey guy, I have a Mark 5 Jetta 2.5. I recently got my hands on a set of Brembo brakes out of an 05 Touareg. Would you guys have any idea if this setup would work on my car?"
Carlos, so you have a 2.5 Jetta and you have the Touareg Brembo brakes. There's a lot of issues around this specific problem. So let's start with this. That anytime you're adding brakes that don't belong on a car, unless somebody has already done R&D to mount specific brakes to a car, which means they have a custom mounting bracket that's been machined to accommodate X brake on Y car, you're going to have to do something custom to make that happen. A lot of people get into this stuff because they get access to these brakes for cheap, either through an eBay purchase or a friend of theirs or whatever, and they get access to Porsche brakes or whatever. I understand why you would want to do that. The problem is, doing that is complicated. Number one, brake lines, you might have to custom fabricate brake lines because there are no such thing as brake lines that exist for that circumstance. That's one barrier. Next barrier is obviously mounting the caliper to the vehicle, to the knuckle in a safe way, obviously making sure that you have the proper stuff machined so that it fits perfectly, runs perfectly, and isn't potential to break, because obviously you never want to put yourself at risk running brakes. The next thing is, Touaregs use a 5x120 bolt pattern, I believe it is, and pretty much all Volkswagens that are non-Touareg run a 5x112 pattern. So which means just the holes in the rotors itself wouldn't bolt up, so you could either have to get them custom drilled or get specific rotors to work. Now again, then you go down the road of trying to figure out what rotors will work with that caliper, and then what pads will work with that caliper and the rotor. We're talking about a lot of complicated stuff that when it comes down to it, you're better off getting a big brake kit, or again, even as we've talked about in the past, a lot of people want better stopping power and don't realize that just better pads and rotors are going to net you the result of getting better braking, as opposed to getting a big brake kit, if that's not a viable option for you financially. And I get why it's not. So if that's not a viable option, then I would go down the road of upgrading pads and rotors as opposed to doing something like that. Thank you so much for watching episode 66 of the AskDAP show, where we answer your Volkswagen Audi questions. If you have any questions or comments about the questions answered in this show, be sure to leave them in the comments below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.